Page 180. Book number 2. Chapter 7. The Legislator. In order to discover the rules of association that are most suitable to nations, a superior intelligence would be necessary who could see all the passions of men without experiencing any of them, who would have no affinity with our nature and yet know it thoroughly, whose happiness would not depend on us, and who would nevertheless be quite willing to interest himself in ours, and, lastly, one who, storing up for himself with the progress of time a far-off glory in the future, could labor in one age and enjoy in another. Gods would be necessary to give laws to men. A nation becomes famous only when its legislation is beginning to decline. We are ignorant during how many centuries the institutions of Lycurgus conferred happiness on the Spartans before they were known in the rest of Greece. The same argument that Caligula adduced as to fact, Plato put forward with regard to right, in order to give an idea of the civil or royal man whom he is in quest of in his work The Statesman. But if it is true that a great prince is a rare man, what will a great legislator be? The first has only to follow the model which the other has to conceive. The latter is the engineer who invents the machine, the former is only the workman who assembles it and turns it on. In the birth of societies, says Montesquieu, it is the leaders of the republics who frame the institutions, and afterwards it is the institutions which mold the leaders of the republics. He who dares undertake to give institutions to a nation ought to feel himself capable, as it were, of changing human nature, of transforming every individual, who in himself is a complete and independent whole, into part of a greater whole, from which he receives in some manner his life and his being, of altering man's constitution in order to strengthen it, of substituting a social and moral existence for the independent and physical existence which we have all received from nature. In a word, it is necessary to deprive man of his native powers in order to endow him with some which are alien to him, and of which he cannot make use without the aid of other people. The more thoroughly those natural powers are deadened and destroyed, the greater and more durable are the acquired powers, and the more solid and perfect also are the institutions, so that if every citizen is nothing, and can be nothing, except in combination with all the rest, and if the force acquired by the whole be equal or superior to the sum of the natural forces of all the individuals, we may say that legislation is at the highest point of perfection which it can attain. The legislator is in all respects an extraordinary man in the state. If he ought to be so by his genius, he is not less so by his office. It is neither magistracy nor sovereignty. This office, which constitutes the republic, does not enter into its constitution, it is a special and superior office, having nothing in common with human jurisdiction, for, if he who rules men ought not to control legislation, he who controls legislation ought not to rule men, otherwise his laws, being ministers of his passions, would often serve only to perpetuate his acts of injustice, he would never be able to prevent private interests from corrupting the sacredness of his work. When Lycurgus gave laws to his country, he began by abdicating his royalty. It was the practice of the majority of the Greek towns to entrust to foreigners the framing of their laws. The modern republics of Italy often imitated this usage, that of Geneva did the same and found it advantageous. Those who consider Calvin only as a theologian are but little acquainted with the extent of his genius. The preparation of our wise edicts, in which he had a large share, does him as much credit as his institutes. Whatever revolution time may bring about in our religion, so long as love of country and of liberty is not extinct among us, the memory of that great man will not cease to be revered. Rome, at her most glorious epoch, saw all the crimes of tyranny spring up in her bosom, and saw herself on the verge of destruction, through uniting in the same hands legislative authority and sovereign power. Yet the decemvirs themselves never appropriated the right to pass any law on their sole authority. Nothing that we propose to you, they said to the people, can pass into law without your consent. Romans, be yourselves the authors of the laws which are to secure your happiness. He who frames laws, then, has, or ought to have, no legislative right, and the people themselves cannot, even if they wished, divest themselves of this incommunicable right, because, according to the fundamental compact, it is only the general will that binds individuals, and we can never be sure that a particular will is conformable to the general will until it has been submitted to the free votes of the people. I have said this already, but it is not useless to repeat it. Thus we find simultaneously in the work of legislation two things that seem incompatible: an enterprise surpassing human powers, and, to execute it, an authority that is a mere nothing. Another difficulty deserves attention. Wise men who want to speak to the vulgar in their own language instead of in a popular way will not be understood. Now, there are 1,000 kinds of ideas which it is impossible to translate into the language of the people. Views very general and objects very remote are alike beyond its reach, and each individual, approving of no other plan of government than that which promotes his own interests, does not readily perceive the benefits that he is to derive from the continual deprivations which good laws impose. In order that a newly formed nation might approve sound maxims of politics and observe the fundamental rules of state policy, it would be necessary that the effect should become the cause, that the social spirit, which should be the product of the institution, should preside over the institution itself, and that men should be, prior to the laws, what they ought to become by means of them. Since, then, the legislator cannot employ either force or reasoning, he must have recourse to an authority of a different order, which can compel without violence and persuade without convincing. It is this which in all ages has constrained the fathers of nations to resort to the intervention of heaven, and to give the gods the credit for their own wisdom, in order that the nations, subjected to the laws of the state as to those of nature, and recognizing the same power in the creation of man and in that of the state, might obey willingly, and bear submissively the yoke of the public welfare. The legislator puts into the mouths of the immortals that sublime reason which soars beyond the reach of common men, in order that he may win over by divine authority those whom human prudence could not move. But it does not belong to every man to make the gods his oracles, nor to be believed when he proclaims himself their interpreter. The great soul of the legislator is the real miracle which must give proof of his mission. Any man can engrave tables of stone, or bribe an oracle, or pretend secret intercourse with some divinity, or train a bird to speak in his ear, or find some other clumsy means to impose himself on the people. He who is acquainted with such means only will perchance be able to assemble a crowd of foolish persons, but he will never found an empire, and his extravagant work will soon perish with him. Empty deceptions form but a transient bond, it is only wisdom that makes it lasting. The Jewish law, which still endures, and that of the child of Ishmael, which for 10 centuries has ruled half the world, still bear witness today to the great men who dictated them, and while proud philosophy or blind party spirit sees in them nothing but lucky impostors, the true statesman admires in their systems the great and powerful genius which directs durable institutions. It is not necessary from all this to conclude with Warburton that politics and religion have among us a common name, but only that, in the origin of nations, one serves as an instrument of the other. Page 183.